Good day everyone. My topic is all about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and it is under in cognitive psychology. So what is extrinsic motivation? Extrinsic motivation is when we are motivated to perform a behavior or engage in an activity because we want to earn a reward or avoid punishment. Ang best example natin dito ay kapag yung nanay natin ay sinabihan tayo na bibigyan tayo ng reward or pera na kapag makakuha tayo ng mataas na grado or marka sa ating report card ay best example ng extrinsic motivation. Ngunit kapag naman ang iyong grade or marka ay mababa, ay may punishment naman na di ka bibigyan ng pera ng iyong inay. Yun naman ay example din ng extrinsic motivation, avoiding punishment. You will engage in behavior not because you enjoy it or because you find it satisfying, but because you expect to get something in return or avoid something unpleasant. What is intrinsic motivation? Intrinsic motivation is when you engage in behavior because you find it rewarding. So, ang best example ng intrinsic motivation is si Sarah ay sumali sa singing contest dahil naramdaman niyang masaya siya dito at yun ang passion niya. So, di niya na kailangan ng kahit na anumang rewards. So, Sarah are performing an activity for its own sake rather than from the desire for some external reward. The behavior itself is its own reward. So this is also an example of extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. First is extrinsic motivation, participating in a sports to win awards. Second, cleaning your room to avoid being reprimanded by your parents. Third is competing in a contest to win a scholarship. And last one is studying because you want to get a good grade. So, in simple word, you are being after in the reward, but you are not interested and you are avoiding in the consequence or punishment. This is also an example of intrinsic motivation. First is participating in a sports because you find the activity enjoyable. Second is cleaning your room because you like tidying up. Third is solving a word puzzle because you find the challenge fun and exciting. And last one is studying a subject you find fascinating. So in simple word, kahit na walang reward, ginagawa mo pa rin ang isang bagay because you find it interesting. Extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, which is best? Extrinsic motivation arises from outside of the individual, while intrinsic motivation comes from within. Research has shown that each type has a different effect on human behavior. Studies have demonstrated that offering excessive external reward for an already internally rewarding behavior can reduce intrinsic motivation, a phenomenon known as the over-justification effect. For example, in a 2008 study, children who were rewarded for playing with a toy they had already expressed interest in playing with became less interested in the item after being externally rewarded. This is not to suggest that extrinsic motivation is a bad thing. It can be beneficial in some situations. For example, extrinsic motivation can be particularly helpful when a person needs to complete a task that they find unpleasant. When to use external rewards? Motivate a person to learn something new. Make a person more interested in an activity that they are not interested in. Provide feedback to people to let them know their performance is worthy of recognition, and when not to use internal rewards. A person is already interested in the topic, task, or activity. Offering a reward will make the activity feel like work instead of play. So both extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation drive human behavior. There are several key differences between motivation that comes from external rewards and that kind that is driven by an individual's genuine interests, including the influence of each type of a person's behavior and the situation in which each type will be most effective. Understanding how each type of motivation works and when it is likely to be useful can help people perform tasks even when they do not want to and improve their learning. Parehas na may maitutulong ang extrinsic and intrinsic, ngunit nakadepende na lang ito sa kung anumang sitwasyon. Kaya't kailangan muna maintindihan at masuri ang sitwasyon kung ano ba ang bagay na motivasyon. Kapag sinabing extrinsic motivation, ibig sabihin external, ibig sabihin outside. Kapag sinabing intrinsic motivation, ibig sabihin internal, ibig sabihin sa loob. So, extrinsic motivation ay galing sa ibang tao at ang intrinsic naman ay motivation galing sa sarili mo. Tinatawag na extrinsic motivation yung isang paghahanda kapag ginagawa niya lang yung bagay para makuha ang reward o kaya naman para ma-avoid ang punishment. Tinatawag naman na intrinsic motivation kapag yung isang tao ginagawa niya ang isang bagay kasi gusto niya kasi nag-e-enjoy siya at dun siya na satisfy. Lagi din tatandaan na di na kailangan ng external reward kapag interested na yung isang tao sa ginagawa niya kasi doon na papasok yung over-justification. And my next topic is all about augmented feedback. So, augmented feedback is defined as feedback from an external source and can be provided as knowledge of result or knowledge of performance, whereas the former provides information about the movement outcome, feedback about goal achievements. The latter informs about the quality of the movement execution. What is an example of augmented feedback? A simple example is a coach giving the softball player information about the position of her arm during the backswing when she throws the ball. The term augmented means the feedback comes from an external or supplementary source. So, ang coach ay nagbigay ng information sa player. So, tinatawag itong extrinsic or external source of augmented feedback. That's all. Thank you.
Good day, I'm Crystal Sean Marie Arcanyanes. So the topic given to me is all about augmented feedback and different process of learning and knowledge of performance versus knowledge of result. What is augmented feedback? Augmented feedback is defined as feedback from an external source and can be provided as knowledge of result or knowledge of performance, whereas the former provides information about the movement outcome or feedback about goal achievements. The latter informs about the quality of the movement execution. These are the process of learning in augmented feedback. Reinforcement learning is not only the process of improving behavior according to given evaluative feedback. It also includes learning how to improve the evaluative feedback itself. Next is use-dependent learning. It is a simple and goal-independent process that forms motor memories by changing movements to become more similar to the previous movement. Knowledge of performance versus knowledge of result. Knowledge of results focuses on how successfully a skill has been performed and is usually associated with the outcome, such as the distance a javelin has been thrown, the accuracy of a golf shot, or the time taken to complete a 100-meter race. An example of knowledge of results is a javelin throwing knowing their attempt landed at 83 meters. Another example would be a sprinter knowing their 100-meter time was 11.2 seconds. As you can see, both of these relate to the result of performance outcome. Why is knowledge of results feedback important? Knowledge of results allow an athlete to measure how successful they were. Without any knowledge of results, learning is extremely slow and often stops. Knowledge of performance focuses on the information about how the action was performed. This includes analysis of the movement patterns, feelings that are created from performing the movement, and even biofeedback. Example of knowledge of performance include heart rate data when running a marathon, the elbow and shoulder angle when releasing a javelin, and the feeling created between the club head and ball when hitting a golf shot. Why is knowledge of performance feedback important? Knowledge of performance allow an athlete to match their movement to an outcome. Without enough or the correct knowledge of performance, learning will be very slow and will often stop. In our putting example, imagine if the golf ball went 5 meters too far but you had no idea how hard you hit the ball, how long your swing was, or how the ball felt when you hit it. Without this information, you are unable to update your solution for your next attempt. Both knowledge of performance and result can be benefit learners of a motor skill, but knowledge of performance may be somewhat better, especially during skill acquisition stage.
Good day, ma'am. I'm Rika May Piboholt. So, my topic is all about dimension of augmented feedback. So, augmented feedback is defined as feedback from an external source, and it can be provided as knowledge of result or knowledge of performance. So, whereas the performer provides information about the movement outcome. So, feedback about the goals and achievement. So, we have 5 dimensions. First is concurrent versus terminal. Concurrent feedback is presented during the movement. Then, terminal feedback is presented after the movement. So, terminal feedback is effective in any skills learning situation, but concurrent feedback is defined as the level of task intrinsic feedback in performing. So, the second is immediate versus delay. Immediate feedback is presented immediately after the relevant action. Then delay feedback is delay in time after the relevant action. Next is verbal versus nonverbal. Verbal feedback is presented in a form that is spoken or capable to being spoken. Example, when the teacher tells their student what he or she did right or wrong during the performance of a skill. Then nonverbal feedback is presented in the form that is not capable for being spoken. This could be include computer-based technology and auditory. Then fourth is accumulate versus distinct. Accumulated feedback is presented an accumulation of past performance. Then distinct feedback presented such performance separately. Then the last is KR versus KP. KR means knowledge of result, is verbalized post-movement information about the outcome of the movement in the environment. Then KP means knowledge of performance, post-movement information about the nature of the movement of pattern. And that's all.
Good day, everyone. This is Kazel Cabaya Cruz. So for today, I am going to discuss about the timing of augmented feedback and frequency of augmented feedback. So let's start from the timing of augmented feedback. So how often and when should we be providing augmented feedback during motor skill learning? So essentially, there are two options that provide feedback at the end after the skill or movement has been performed or during while the skill is being performed currently. So, terminal augmented feedback means you are providing the feedback afterwards, while the concurrent augmented feedback means you are providing the feedback during the movement. So, terminal augmented feedback is appropriate in any motor skill learning situation. Concurrent augmented feedback is most affected when the task's intrinsic feedback is absent or difficult to use. So if you can't see the target or it's difficult to interpret whether you are doing something correctly, and while you are doing it, then it could be useful to give augmented feedback during the task. But overall, we should usually avoid concurrent augmented feedback. It commonly results in a negative learning effect because the person is too likely to become dependent on that augmented feedback. So, if you are giving feedback while the person is engaging in the skill all the time, then the person will grow to depend on that feedback while they are performing that skill. And then, when they try to perform the skill without the feedback, they will perform worse than it had they never gotten the feedback in the first place. It also directs their attention away from the critical task intrinsic feedback. So it directs their attention away from their own experience of the movement and their own ability to determine whether they are doing it correctly. And instead, they are paying attention to the feedback that you are providing them with, so then they become dependent on that feedback. So, it is not advisable except maybe in rare cases or for very specific type of tasks where it's necessary or they won't be able to learn the task. So, the next is the frequency of the augmented feedback. So, frequency, how often should we be providing augmented feedback? It has been established in the literature that we should not be giving augmented feedback after every single attempt. So, the optimal frequency is not 100%. It should be less than that. Now, how much less probably? It depends on the specific skill and the skill level of the learner who is learning the skill. So, the guidance hypothesis say that the role of augmented feedback in learning is to guide performance towards the goal of the task. So, guidance is not necessary with giving feedback after every single attempt. So, it should be infrequent feedback because if it's provided too frequently, it can cause a learner to develop a dependency, and that's not really guidance. In that case, you are sort of carrying the weight of that skill instead of guiding the person to execute the skill correctly. So they would develop a dependency and perform poorly when augmented feedback is not available. So, less frequent is better. So, that's all for my report. Thank you for listening. God bless.
Good day everyone, especially to you sir. My name is Maria Lea Rodriguez. So today, I am going to discuss about augmented feedback can facilitate motor performance and learning. So the researchers have explored another area of motor learning, the role of augmented feedback in skill acquisition. When individuals move, they receive sensory feedback from the various receptors in their bodies. So this feedback, coming as a result of movement, is termed intrinsic because it comes from the body's internal sensory receptors. For example, when a softball player throws a ball continuously, receptors provide information about the texture of the ball. Proprioceptors indicate muscle length and tension of the throwing arm, and visual receptors provide visual information regarding the trajectory and end position of the ball. In addition to this naturally occurring feedback, other performance-related feedback can come from the external sources. So, the next is the individual difference in the benefits of feedback for learning. So, in this topic on learning from feedback has produced ambiguous guidelines for feedback design. Some have advocate minimal feedback, whereas others have recommended more extensive feedback that highly supported performance. So, the objective of the current study was to investigate how individual differences resolve previous conflicted findings. In addition, learning requires the use of cognitive resources and effort thus may exceed the optimal capability for other individuals, especially those with reduced and impaired information processing abilities. That's all. Thank you.
So, good day. My name is Mark Steven Buico from BPED 2F. Our topic is all about augmented feedback. So, mine report is subliminal augmented feedback and motor learning. During daily life kasi, the central nervous system constantly receives and processes sensory input providing information on the state of our body and the surrounding world. Although we do not constantly perceive all sensory inputs, this may nevertheless have consequences for our future behavior. Since learning may be reinforced by augmented feedback and subliminal stimuli, which are not consciously perceived may after behavior, it may indeed be the hypothesis that learning can also be facilitated by subliminal augmented feedback on motor performances. So, let's define first supraliminal and subliminal. So, in supraliminal is the existing above the threshold of consciousness, while subliminal naman it is the below the threshold of sensation of consciousness. Motor learning skills based on subliminal augmented feedback has not yet been constantly demonstrated. It is however a very interesting area. So, as it may be beneficial to combine augmented feedback modalities in motor learning, it may be also potentially be beneficial to combine supraliminal and subliminal augmented feedback. So, that's subliminal augmented feedback and motor learning. As a conclusion of all our reports, augmented feedback is very powerful to facilitate performances of each person's motor skills. So that's it. Thank you.